Welcome back to Managing the Insider Threat, What Every Organization Should Know. Our next presentation is Emerging Trends, presented by Bill Claycomb and Andy Moore. Bill was a lead research scientist for the CERT Enterprise Threat and Vulnerability Management Program at CERT. His primary research topic is the insider threat. Current work includes discovery of insider threat behavioral patterns and corresponding socio-technical countermeasures. Andy Moore is a lead researcher in the CERT Insider Threat Center and senior member of the technical staff at the SEI. He explores ways to improve the security, survivability, and resiliency of enterprise systems through insider threat and defense modeling, incident management, and architecture engineering and analysis. Bill, Andy, welcome. The stage is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We want to talk about how emerging trends, specifically technology and emerging trends, enable new types of insider attacks. What types of attacks are we seeing or do we expect to see as the result of certain emerging technologies? Now, clearly, cloud computing and mobile devices and social networking are not emerging technologies. We use them every day. But the ways that they enable insider attacks are emerging, and we are starting to see those technologies used in more and more cases of insider threat. So we'll talk briefly about each of the topics, and then at the end, talk about some future threats, some things that we see on the horizon, things that may even be starting to happen today. But we'll turn it over to Andy to talk about the expanding complexity of insiders.
Thanks, Bill. So we've seen the complexity of the insider threat domain kind of expand, get more complex over time. With regard, and this slide shows a number of factors here. With regard to collusion with outsiders, this was especially a factor in insider fraud cases. There we saw about half of the cases involving some sort of collusion with outsiders. Often the outsiders were providing funds to insiders for information that they used to continue the fraud. In about a third of those fraud cases, the outsider actually induced the crime. That is, they were approaching the insider because they knew that insider had access to information that they could use. With regard to business partners, our definition of insider has expanded from employees to current and former employees to business partners. So we were looking at anybody who had or has access to authorized information that could be used to harm their employing organization. In terms of mergers and acquisitions, we continue to try to discover the vulnerability points, the points of vulnerability that organizations faced with regard to the insider threat. Mergers and acquisitions was one of those vulnerability points. It's a time of heightened risk. It's a time of a lot of turmoil within organizations. And it's a time that roles and responsibilities are changing. There may be layoffs within the organization. And there may be disgruntlement, especially if there are layoffs. But even with the changing responsibilities, a lot of these can cause disgruntlement and expand the insider threat that an organization faces. Another aspect is cultural differences. So in a merger or an acquisition, a lot of times if a company is going overseas, there will be, say, U.S. cultural ideas with external culture, different cultural ideas. How do those combine? And often things that used to work in the past no longer works, and people don't understand the new policies that they're under. Finally, the second to last is foreign allegiances. As organizations go outsource some of their function, as they expand into branches overseas, and as we look at the theft of IP cases, many of those cases involved transfer of information to foreign entities, foreign governments, other external individuals that were homed outside the United States. And so this was a big threat with respect to theft of intellectual property. Lastly, technology advances, which is what this project is really, or this section is really all about, is these new and emerging technologies and the potential for additional attack paths that these create for the insider threat. And so this is another expanding aspect of the threat. So I'll turn this over to Bill to talk about cloud computing.
Thank you. So when we think about cloud computing and the insider threat, I think what most people think about is the rogue administrator, the bad guy at the cloud service provider that has access to an organization's data and may steal that data or use it in a malicious way. Right? This has been identified by the Cloud Security Alliance as one of the top threats to cloud computing in a document that they put out a few years ago. But there are other types of insider threats related to cloud computing, and really that's what we want to focus on today. Because while the administrator at a cloud security provider is an insider threat, it's really an insider threat to the cloud security provider. Right? It's their insider problem. It's not an insider threat to the organization. It's still a threat to the organization, but not necessarily. It's more like an external threat to the organization. This chart sort of outlines that relationship. So the bottom we have the victim organization, and within an organization you have data, resources. You have employees, and some of those employees are malicious. They want to harm the organization. And you have victim organization data. Right? Now, the malicious employee traditionally, from an insider point of view, will go after the data, the resources of the organization, sabotage, for instance, or they'll go after the data to steal it for to sell or to take to another company. So organizations realize this, and CERT, the Insider Threat Center, has been helping organizations protect themselves against these types of threats. And so that's sort of what the red dashed lines indicate there is organizations are able to take steps to protect these resources. And that may or may not stop the attacks. But organizations have a handle on, or fairly good handle on, how to do that. But now we introduce the cloud. And in the cloud, we have cloud provider employees, and there are probably bad cloud provider employees, and they have access to the victim organization's data. But that's not the type of attack that we're worried about from an insider perspective. What we're worried about is the malicious employee within the victim organization being able to attack the data in the cloud, the organization's data that is no longer just here, but it's in the cloud. And the other type of thing we're worried about is the malicious employee using the resources of the cloud, which you can see, and we've graphically tried to illustrate, are significantly bigger than the resources of the organization, using those resources to carry out attacks. So this is all coming from an inside employee. One last note on the cloud provider employees being malicious and attacking victim organization data. That is a big deal. We haven't seen many cases of that happening, or we haven't seen any specifically happening from cloud providers. We have seen cases where trusted business partners take advantage of that type of relationship. So it does happen, but we haven't seen it from cloud providers. But research does continue. We have one of our colleagues, Dr. Lori Flynn, is currently doing a study where she's evaluating security policies with cloud service providers specifically related to insider threat. Some of our friends at Oxford University, Adrian Duncan, are doing work that looks at different ways that an insider might attack organization data in the cloud from a malicious administrator point of view. But we're looking at the malicious employee within the organization attacking the data or using cloud resources to attack the organization. Again, it's rare that a rogue administrator from the cloud provider would attack. And I know I said I was done talking, but this one last point is that the cloud service providers have a lot to lose if they were to have some sort of insider attack. So they're well motivated to thoroughly vet the employees that they hire and to carefully monitor them. So the malicious local employee attacking an organization's data in the cloud. An example weakness of this might be that an organization who either uses a cloud for some sort of service or data storage doesn't always have the level of control that they have if they have a server on site. Right? A server on site, you can pull the plug. You can physically shut it off. Right? Not so easy to do with a cloud provider. And we've seen example cases where an organization was under attack, and they knew they were under attack, and they tried to shut down the service that was being attacked. In this case, it was email, but they were unable to do it quickly enough because they had to go through a process of verifying their identity with the cloud provider, and they didn't have the correct information. And as a result, the attack was much more damaging than it could have been if they'd just been able to pull the plug. And so this is an instance where, because they didn't have control of the resources directly, the attack was much worse. The other thing to think about when storing data in the cloud is that access control models may be different. An organization that's had the same access control model for years and years locally and is used to managing that, is used to granting and revoking permissions, may find that in the cloud it's a different model, and maybe they're not as good at managing that. The other thing to think about is an employee that uses the cloud to attack the organization. The cloud is a very powerful tool, and all you need to use that tool is money. So you can buy CPU time. You can buy network bandwidth, right? You can do things with CPU, lots of CPUs like crack password files. You can do things with lots of network traffic like launch denial of service attacks. Now, cloud providers are aware of this, and most of them do take measures to prevent that sort of thing from happening, but not all do that. So what if a disgruntled employee really wanted to hurt the company and had the company's credit card, right, and were to purchase the power necessary to really have an effective attack on harming that company? That's the type of insider threat that we're concerned about. So how do we protect against those types of insiders? Well, those that exploit the weakness in the cloud, it's important to have diligence in planning any migration to the cloud or any use of cloud service. We're not saying that it's not secure. We're not saying it's any less secure. It's just organizations need to be very careful from the insider perspective, looking at their own employees and relationship to the cloud in terms of how they plan those transitions. And there needs to be clear paths for handling incidents, right? Authentication and authorization between the organization and the service provider. Very carefully crafted service level agreements that clearly spell out the expectations from both parties. Those that might use the cloud against you, it's important to monitor what employees are doing. So being able to detect when somebody is potentially gearing up to launch an attack. Limiting access to those potential exfiltration resources. You know, the single most common way that insider threats use the cloud against a company is not necessarily, well, it's certainly not using the cloud to launch an attack. It's using cloud services to exfiltrate data, and that's a big, long term for web-based email, right? Or web-based file storage services. So if your organization allows people to access web-based personal email or web-based file storage services, that is a very easy way to exfiltrate information. And so limiting access to those resources or monitoring carefully can definitely help prevent those that would use the cloud against you from harming the company. That may include even creating separate environments for external communication. Right, here's our internal network. It's only used for work purposes. Here's our external network. It's okay for acceptable personal use, but they don't touch. That's one possible way to mitigate that threat. So now I'd like to talk about mobile devices. Again, not an emerging technology by itself. Mobile devices have been around for a long time now. But we're starting to see insiders use them in increasingly more clever and difficult to detect ways. So one of the trends that's enabling this is organizations moving to a more mobile workforce. This is a transition that's been going on for many years now, but it seems to be accelerating, that employees can work from home more often, work remotely. So sometimes that remote access is only on organizations or corporately owned machines, but more often it's on personally owned machines. Remote access is possible on smartphones, for instance, or iPads, things like that. So allowing people or employees to remotely access organizations' resources from their personally owned mobile devices is very limiting to the organization in terms of what they are then able to monitor or enforce. So some of the ways that could be exploited is users using the cameras or microphones or other applications for collecting data. It doesn't have to be a physical data transfer with a cord plugged into a machine. Taking a picture of a computer screen is just as easy, is a very easy way to capture the information on that screen in a way that can't be tracked on host-based monitoring solutions. Mobile devices have incredible amounts of storage now. It's no longer an issue of do I have enough disk space to get out information. The storage is incredible. They have capabilities for remote access, for doing more complicated things like remote desktop, for instance, where you actually can be a part of the corporate network. You're not just sort of touching it and getting email on an infrequent basis. And they have wireless capabilities, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, cellular, which provides very easy means for employees to extract that information and send it away immediately. They don't have to carry it out physically anymore. They have the ability to transmit. So, so like I said, the devices sometimes are owned by the employer, but they're finding it now perhaps more economical, but primarily more from an employee satisfaction standpoint to let employees bring their own devices. BYOD, bring your own device. And we're seeing more and more. There's a reference here on the slide to an article that from 2011 that shows that indeed employees prefer to choose their own device, to use their own device and choose which device they want to use for work. Maybe they're a Mac person, maybe they're a PC person, maybe they work better on an iPad. Whatever it is, they want to choose their own device, and it's easier for them if it's their own device. So this is an emerging attack platform. Right? The capability is there. It continues to increase the capability of insiders to carry out these attacks. So the risks of employee-owned devices are limited monitoring. The employer really has limited capability to monitor the entire device. Now, organizations can be very careful and very good at setting up agreements with employees who use their personal devices for corporate email, for instance. If an organization allows that, they can specify that the organization has the authority to monitor that email use or even remotely wipe the device should it become necessary. But they really don't have the opportunity to monitor other things, personal email or the types of apps that are on the device, that sort of thing. Let's see. Not sure if I accidentally backed up there. No, I guess I didn't. Let's see, lost my place. Here we go. Right. As I mentioned, they can control what happens on the corporate email side. But the phone also has capability to do personal email, and often would. It would do both personal and work email. Now that sets up the opportunity for an unintentional type of insider threat, where the insider intends to send something sensitive or whatever from the corporate email account, but instead sends it via the personal email account, or the contacts are intermingled in everyone's probably done this, where you intend to send it to one person and you intend instead send it to somebody with a very similar name that just happened to pop up first in your auto populate feature. So that's another risk of unintentional insider threats with mobile devices. Now, if an employer owns the device, they have more ability to monitor, to specify which apps are allowed, what kind of use is allowed, that sort of thing. But the device still has the capability to exfiltrate information. Using employer-owned devices does not solve the problem, but it may be easier to monitor for unauthorized use. Now, a compromised mobile device, whether it's employee-owned or employee or employer-owned, they can all be compromised. And so a compromised mobile devices would be another type of unintentional threat, where it allows an external attacker to potentially access internal corporate resources, because the insider is unintentionally carrying that attacker's access point into the organization with them. The other thing that we might see is that devices may automatically sync data to locations that don't have adequate security. So cloud storage, for instance, if you sync to cloud storage, is there any way to, well, there is a way, is have you ensured that the data is encrypted, that it's protected, right? That you're not syncing to a folder somewhere that may unintentionally have public access and the information is in clear text. Social media services, another way that data might accidentally be leaked due to synchronization issues, or even personal computers. If I back up my personal device, which has corporate email, if I back that up to my home PC, which I would do because it's my personal device, now I've got potentially corporate information on another personally owned device. And how well is that device protected? So you can see that it's really a big challenge. So what should you do? Well, organizations should strongly consider limiting remote access by mobile devices. And by this, I really mean the full-blown remote access, the ability to have a remote desktop from a mobile device, because we use mobile devices in very public places, right? And shoulder surfing is a big threat there, where I may be using my iPad, but I'm remotely connected to my office and I'm doing something that has a document that's somewhat sensitive, right? But I'm doing that in a public place, and people don't often think about the risks of somebody else overseeing that. The other, obviously, reason to limit remote access and access in general of mobile devices to sensitive areas is that unintentional threat. That the device may be compromised, an attacker may be able to remotely turn on a microphone, for instance. And if you're in a sensitive area having a sensitive conversation, even though you're not using the phone, you don't think it's turned on, it may actually be. So at the very least, limit mobile device access and use in sensitive areas to eliminate those unintentional threats, as well as try to mitigate the person who will intentionally try to use that mobile device to take data. So if possible, remote access, the really full-blown remote access, if you can limit that to corporate-owned devices only, you'll give yourself a better chance at being able to monitor and detect the malicious activity. So that goes to the next point, is monitor all remote access transactions as closely as possible. Know who's connected remotely all the time. Know how to shut them off. We have cases where an employee was terminated, went home, but he had an active VPN session, remote access, an active VPN session. So they disabled his account, but because he had the session active, it didn't get turned off. It didn't cut off automatically, and he was still able to access the organization remotely and cause damage. So know how to monitor for those types of remote access and how to terminate them if necessary. And so that goes to the last point about disabling remote access right away. Okay, I'll turn it over to Andy to talk about social networking.
Thanks, Bill. So here we're going to talk about social networking and the way that can be used to amplify social engineering. So a social network is a social structure made up of a set of social actors, individuals and organizations, and a set of dyadic, that is pairwise ties between those actors. So we talk about two different areas of insider threat here, online social networking via social media services, and non-technical forms of social networking, more traditional forms that involve family relationships, cultural relationships, that sort of thing. So in terms of the risks here, we've got personal information being used to identify likely attacks within a company. So if you think of it, intelligence gathering by cyber attackers is a common approach. You gather as much information as you can. Social media, social networking allows you to collect information to, for instance, target specific users, so-called spear phishing. And that kind of information may also help identify likely candidates for a collusion. As I mentioned previously, the fraud crimes that we've looked at had a lot of outsider collusion. So, and in many of those cases, outsiders were approaching insiders. So social media gives that avenue for finding out about the insiders, even a broader path to go down. So, studies have shown that people bare their souls on social media, social networking. That's where they tell about a lot of things that are happening in their life. some of which are with respect to their work life. So you can find about who's disgruntled, who's not, and approaching those disgruntled employees is going to be a more profitable avenue for an external person that's trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. And data loss here may be either intentional or accidental. And typically with social media, the insider, is not purposely or maliciously trying to disclose information. It just happens. It's an accident. In many cases, they aren't aware of the potential for the data loss, what's important to the organization, what's not. And this can be exploited by the external actors, for instance, by gleaning information about, personal information about the insider, information that can be used to break into that user's accounts. Employees are also not typically aware of the harm that negative comments on social media sites can do to an organization. And this information, while an organization can take many years to build up a good reputation, negative information about an organization, whether it's true or not, can be very hard to dispel. Finally, data loss can be very difficult to detect. So an organization may start losing competitiveness in their domain and not really realize why that is the case. And potentially it's due to loss of confidential information by the organization through some of these types of avenues. So what should you do? We separate this into kind of what most organizations should consider, and then what larger organizations with more resources should consider. So for most organizations, you're going to want to establish a social media policy, define what acceptable use is. And this is typically going to educate the workforce about the information within the organization that is the critical asset, the intellectual property that should not be disclosed to the outside world, or even close friends on a social media site. You not only need to define policy, but you need to make sure that people understand the policy through security awareness training. You need to make sure that they understand the reasons why those are in place. There's good reasons why that's in place, and people following that is the benefit of the organization as a whole. Encouraging people to report suspicious contacts. As I mentioned, in the fraud area, a lot of outsiders were contacting insiders. If an insider knows the potential for this and knows that the organization realizes that this can happen, they're potentially going to be a lot less likely to fall for that kind of either deception or fall into that fraud scheme. For larger organizations, you can consider monitoring the use of social media across the organization by employees. But as the next slide will show, there are a lot of cautions that an organization needs to consider here. A 2012 National Labor Relations Board report looked into the issue about what organizations could say in these policies and recommended that they avoid policy language that prohibits posts discussing negative aspects of the organization, non-public information or negative comments about their salaries, their work conditions, that sort of thing. Mostly this is a free speech sort of thing. You can't tell employees what they can't say with regard to that, typically. That's what this report described. In terms of monitoring social media, organizations also need to use caution. You can't really penalize employees for discussing work conditions such as pay online. So that's a free speech issue. In some cases, we've seen that an organization's monitoring of social media has opened the door to discrimination lawsuits against the organization. If an employee discloses some protected status that they have on their social media sites and the organization finds out about this, it can cause problems. Finally, in some cases, we discovered that some employers were asking employees or prospective employees, candidates for employment, to give them their social networking site passwords as a, perhaps as a means to gaining job. This again some states have noticed this and enacted legislation specifically restricting employers from doing this, using social media in this way, social media monitoring. Other types of social networking, so here are the non-technical and more traditional types of social networking. And I mentioned before that about 30% of our theft of IP cases involved transferring sensitive information outside the country. And many of the insiders involved in these cases had significant social networks that extended into those external destinations of the information. And the question is, how can an organization, how does the social network of insiders indicate increased risk, increased insider threat risk for the organization? And what can an organization legally and ethically do if a relationship between the social network of their employees and increased threat does exist? What can an organization do about that? So this is an open area of research, really, and because of the changing landscape of both social media technology as well as the laws and regulations in this area, it's one that organizations need to maintain open connection and dialogue with their legal counsel. For more information, the Common Sense Guide to Mitigating Insider Threats, which I believe you have access to, at least a link to, in your package, provides more information on this area for Practice 18. For social engineering, so how might social media amplify the risks and the ability of external entities to social engineer insiders? We've seen this happen in many of our cases. In the fraud area, we have schemes in which an insider or an outsider discovers or exploits vulnerabilities in the insurance claim processes. So it was an organized crime case where the organized criminals created fake addresses for real doctors and started submitting false insurance claims to the government, and millions of dollars were paid out before these schemes were discovered. Also in the sabotage area, we've got cases where insiders used social engineering, and in particular one case where an insider used intimidation of his coworkers to gain access to backup tapes. And by stealing these backup tapes, he amplified the effect of his sabotage attack, which was to delete all the critical manufacturing software for the organization. So the organization had a much more difficult time recovering in that case. The Verizon study talked about several technical tactics. Phishing, of course, was very prominent there. They talked also about a technique called doxing. This is where a person looks for information with regard to a particular person, so they're targeting a particular person, trying to find out particular personal information about that person in order to be able to exploit that information to gain access to, say, other sites. So maybe finding information about the security questions that person might have used to protect their password. Waterhole attacks is another type of attack where they're not targeting an individual, but they're targeting an organization. So they set up, or they identify what websites that organization is likely to go to, and then they infect that website, and eventually they get an employee of the target organization to access that information, access that site, get infected, and then they've got their into that organization. So these kinds of attacks feature prominently even in some of the high-profile attacks we've seen recently. In terms of a couple of studies that have shown the prevalence of social engineering attacks, the 2012 Ponemon study showed that 38% of the respondents had experienced a phishing or social engineering attack over that year. And the 2013 Verizon data breach report showed kind of even a more startling statistic that 29% of the breaches studied leveraged social tactics in some way. And this happened to be a fourfold increase from 2012. So we saw a fair ramp up in that kind of tactic being used against organizations. In terms of vectors here, email was very prominent, 79% in that Verizon study. Not surprising because the phishing attacks were so prominent. And in-person attacks, the attackers still like to be engaging individual persons in many of these. And the third class, which was about 3%, was social engineering by phone. Finally, what were the positions of people that were targeted for social engineering? Here, there were a lot of unknowns in the Verizon study, but among the highest percentage there were executives and managers at 27%. And probably they were targeting them because they've got access to the most confidential information and potentially the most information within the organization they have access to. So that was the highest one there. And also former employees. And I was kind of scratching my head about why that was true. But I think, the potential there is that former employees don't have the allegiance to the previous organization and so may be more vulnerable to a social engineering attack. Now we're off to future threats, Bill.
Thank you. So future threats, specifically future threats in terms of technology that insiders may be able to leverage for attacks. Certainly not all future threats to all of cybersecurity. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but just a couple of things that came to mind when we brainstormed what future technology insiders might use to carry out attacks. And organizations need to be always mindful of what's around the corner. Right? What is the latest and greatest technology that people are showcasing, even showing proof of concepts, and starting to think about how is that going to affect my security and specifically the ability of insiders to harm the company. So in terms of new technologies that enable attacks, one of the specific examples is a USB device emulator. So these are devices that plug into USB ports that emulate keyboards, for instance, right? So companies may have prohibitions about plugging in USB storage, but pretty much every keyboard that plugs in is a USB keyboard. And so these are devices that plug in, they to the operating system look like a keyboard, and in fact act like a keyboard, but they carry out a very automated series of keystrokes, which is pre-programmed and is an attack. So the person plugging that in doesn't even need to know how to carry out that attack. Somebody else has figured that out and put it on this device. Here, plug this in. You plug it in, the computer thinks it's a keyboard, but bam, the correct keystrokes have been automatically fed to the device, and now it's perhaps compromised. So these are new types of technologies. Maybe the vulnerability will be to an existing technology, and even worse, if this is an existing technology that's so embedded that it's difficult to protect against. At the recent Black Hat conference, they showed how a device that effectively extends cell phone coverage, extends cell phone range. It's essentially a little cube that acts as a cell phone tower, presumably within your house. to provide the boost the signal to cell phones within a house could be compromised and emulated so that the traffic that went through that device could be captured by an attacker. And what's scary about this is that cell phones will connect to the strongest source automatically. There's no way to tell your phone not to connect to that type of device because it thinks it's a cell phone tower. Now, fortunately, the vulnerability in this case has been patched and corrected, but this is just an example of what if somebody finds a vulnerability that we can't patch. The other thing to consider is technology is becoming smaller and more integrated in our everyday lives. That's nothing new, right? Of course. Think about Google Glass, right? And what are the abilities of an insider to use technology like that, where you can record anything in an instant just by speaking a command or moving your head? How does that enable the ability of somebody to exfiltrate information? I read a story several years ago about a guy who embedded an RFID chip in his hand. And then he enabled his house or installed RFID readers in his house so that to open his door, he just waved his hand in front of the reader and it unlocked the door, right? Well, if somebody's able to do that, what will be possible in the future? What's possible now, what's possible in the future in terms of embedding storage devices, for instance, right? That gives a whole new meaning to the word thumb drive, right? If I actually have a drive in my thumb. So these are things that organizations need to stay ahead of, if possible. Now, you can't ban new technology. You can't ban anything new from your organization. You're not going to get any new employees. But you need to be very careful about the use policies that you put in place to allow those employees to use that technology, and clearly communicate with employees what the expectations are about technology use, personal devices, social media, social engineering, cloud-based web services, that sorts of thing. So that wraps up the main parts of our talk. Be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Before we jump into the Q&A, I was just wondering, so this is very new research in a new area. What kind of outputs do you guys expect? How do you get this information out to people? Do you expect technical reports to be the way to get, or do you update the common sense guide? Do you guys have a plan? What is the way to get this information out there as you develop it?
Andy?
Well, I think you hit, we do a yearly or every 2-year update of our common sense guide based on looking at new cases. We put out research reports on the current state of our research internally, and we have an insider threat workshop. It's a 2-day workshop that we put on for organizations. Perhaps the audience has heard that.
Yeah, it came up. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So those are the main sources.
Just to sort of echo what Andy said, we do try to reach different communities in different ways. So we'll put out things on the website for organizations. We'll speak at conferences like RSA, where there are thousands of people in attendance from an industrial perspective. But we also will publish in research venues, academic research venues, the more in-depth research that we do. So we do definitely try to get out.
Right, it's obviously a very rapidly changing environment that you're working in.
So all of these things are refreshed. Our workshop, our assessment. We have an assessment that I think Randy might have talked about previously.
Okay.
That's regularly updated with regard to the newest aspects and avenues of attack.
Okay. A question from Kim, and this is stuff we kind of got into, but people log in and out at different times, so we may repeat some of the information you went over before. But Kim wants to know, what can an organization do to protect itself from risks inherent to employees connecting their personally owned devices to the network?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a very real risk. The organization needs to be able to monitor the employee's activity when they're using corporate resources. So when they're connected to the corporate resources, the organization needs to know what's going on. And so whether you have that monitoring capability sort of at the gateway between your organization and the employee's device, or whether you're able to specifically monitor certain components of that device. It's much more difficult when it's a personally owned device. It's easier when the organization owns the device. But if it's personally owned, the organization needs to have clear policies that are in place that are communicated to the employees. We're allowed to monitor your email use. We're allowed to remotely wipe your device if it gets lost. And by wipe, I don't mean just the email, the whole thing. Now, if you can just wipe the email, that's even better. But if employees are allowed to store data, then so it's a tricky question. But having consistent policies and communicating those clearly to employees and being able to monitor everything that goes on between that personal device and the organization is critical.
Okay, a comment from Jimmy I wanted to address. I think one of our slides had some resources links at the bottom that are going to the same place. So I just want to tell him we'll get that fixed, Jimmy, and swap out the slide deck that people can download to make sure. I think the Verizon report is linking back to something, one of the earlier resources.
Thanks for letting us know.
Yeah, so we'll get that updated. Thank you for that. Next question from Ron asking, what can an organization do to reduce the risk of successful social engineering in the workplace?
Good question. We haven't done a lot of research in there, so I didn't talk much about that. But there are a couple of things you can do. Kind of traditionally, we would look at security awareness training, making sure that people are aware of the threats of social engineering, the current tactics that people are using. And just making sure that they're aware of the risk and what they need to be careful about. There's also the potential for reducing an organization's profile and individual insiders, employees' profile on the internet in terms of their personal information, sensitive information that can be used to further an attack by an outsider. On the more novel level, there's a group here at CMU called the Scilab Usability and Security, it's CUPS, Usability and Privacy Center. That's not an S, but CUPS is the acronym. And they do some novel work in terms of training organizations to respond to, in terms of training employees and making sure that they understand when, for instance, phishing attacks are in place and being perpetrated on them, and when links that they might click on are okay. And so I would check out the CUPS website for more information with regard to some novel training that can be used in this area.
Great. Bill and Andy, that's all the time we have. Thank you for a great presentation.